Welcome to this event here at the Center for Global Development. Today, it's my privilege to moderate a conversation amongst some leaders and experts in the field of global education. And we want to talk primarily today about the consequences of the COVID pandemic on education going forward, and what are the challenges, choices, trade offs that national leaders are going to face, that international institutions that support global education are also going to have to grapple with going forward. Uh, Facts as to what's happening to education now are well rehearsed by now. We know that 9 out of 10 children have been impacted in terms of being out of school for at least part of the time this year. And we know that this comes on top of an existing learning crisis in education. 8 out of 10 kids in the world really could not read properly by the age of 10. So already we started off with a difficult situation. And here on top of that, we're not only going to be impacted this year, but looking forward, we can already extrapolate based on previous crises that the world has gone through, what's going to happen to children who are out of school. We know that a lot of girls are not going to come back to school. They may end up going for uh, being in early marriages. And we know also that this has an impact not just on education, but on stunting for a lot of kids for whom meals at school have been a big part of their daily diet. So I think in many, many ways, people have already begun to map out the consequences of this crisis. I think we also know, and that's really what I'm hoping we can talk about, that as a result of this crisis, the economic consequences for many countries and for international agencies will be that their funding is going to be under pressure. And when funding is under pressure, at the level of households, at the level of governments, at the level of international institutions, this means that many of the choices that people had before become harder. And sometimes the choices disappear because those opportunities are no longer there. And I want to sort of explore with this eminent group of leaders what they think is likely to transpire, and how we can prepare for it, because this is the moment to prepare for the time that comes after this wave of the crisis, as well as to battle the crisis itself. We have a fantastic group of people with whom we're going to have this conversation. Alice Albright, who's the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education, also has a distinguished career before becoming CEO of GPE, working in the US Exim Bank, working also as the CFO at Gavi. So Alice brings a lot of expertise to it. Rose Baguna. Rose Baguma is the Director General in the Ministry of Education in Rwanda. Rwanda has been one of the countries that we often cite in terms of being more cautious and dealing with the education crisis, or with the COVID crisis more generally, taking steps early. And of course, it'd be very useful to get the perspective from a national leader. Jaime Saavedra. Jaime is currently the director for the Global Partnership on Education, the Global Practice on Education, sorry, I should have said, at the World Bank. Uh, Jaime also has a very distinguished and actually quite a varied career, both as a national leader, as a politician, a minister, as an academic, and also as somebody who has worked in many international organizations. So, Jaime, you're in many ways the embodiment of all the different perspectives and challenges. Very much looking forward to your perspective on this. And then to round it off, I want to also come last but not least to Susanna Harris. Susanna Harris here at the Center for Global Development is the co-director of our program on education, and has an experience herself of working in education in Africa and internationally across many countries in her previous roles as well. So With that background, I want to start off by asking each of you to give a little bit your perspective. And let me start with Alice. And Alice, perhaps you could reflect a little bit on how you see from the lessons of previous crises what the impact is likely to be, particularly on funding choices, and how well prepared we are today to be able to deal with some of the trade offs that lie ahead of us.
Thank you so much, Masood, for organizing this in CGD. We, of course, love doing events with CGD. Many longtime friends there, and so I hope you all are doing well. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Dr. Rose. Rwanda has shown us the way for how to respond to COVID, and in fact was the first country that was a receiver of funding from GPE to help contend with COVID. It's always wonderful to be here with Jaime, who's a dear partner and friend. We work closely with the World Bank, and Susanna, wonderful to see you as well. Unfortunately, COVID has shown us something that I think we really have already known in some ways, which is that education is vital. And while COVID has certainly not caused an education crisis, it has deepened the crisis that we have now. So it's not a new crisis, but it is one. COVID has deepened what we are seeing now. Even before the crisis, there were 258 million children who were out of school. That equals about 17% of the students who were on the globe, and millions more were not learning. We were seeing some improvements, but of course, COVID has put the brakes on all of that. As you've hinted at, Masood, the economic impact ahead of us is going to be substantial. The latest forecasts show that GDP across the globe will go down just in 2020 by 8%. And of course, there's more to come. Those facts will have an impact on aid budgets globally. We expect aid to go down by $2 billion by 2022, and that number may not recover and go back to 2018 levels for 6 years. So the COVID crisis is having a serious threat to education aid that will be available. In terms of what we do about it, one of the things that is top of mind for us is safeguarding education spending. One of the things that we're particularly worried about right now is the degree of debt servicing. At least 30 of GPE's countries spend half of the money that they spend on education on servicing debt. So when you think about growing debt levels, that indeed is a trade-off. While some of the actions that have been taken by the G20 through the end of the year in terms of suspending payments are a good start, they're not enough. And we have to go further with relieving debt, restructuring debt, and things of that nature. The key question that you've asked is one about trade-offs. And I think right now is not the time to think about trade-offs. I think that cutting spending on education would be immensely short-sighted. What we've seen more than anything since March is that the availability of talented people to contend with this crisis is absolutely vital, whether or not they're teachers or doctors or nurses or policymakers. Now is the time to lean into education investments. However, we have to do better, and this is an opportunity to do better. And we have to think about things like efficiency. We have to think about how to get money to the front line of education more effectively, getting money to teachers, procuring things more effectively, and things of that nature. We have seen some important trends emerging. One is leaning into different forms of technology to enable education to happen on a distance basis. All the countries that have applied for GPE funding are showing using different forms of technology across the spectrum of technology. Remote learning, I think, is something that is going to be here to stay, and it will require changes of teachers, administrators, households, content, curriculum across the board. It will also open up the need to lean into internet availability, connectivity, and electricity, which for many people are still really unnecessary barriers to getting greater access to education on a remote basis. You'll be pleased to know, for those who are following the education sector, that the partners in the education sector are working very closely and very effectively together. We're delighted to be a part of UNESCO's Education Coalition. There's a new campaign that is being worked on called Save Our Futures, which is going to highlight some of the advocacy and gaps that we need to fill. So keep an eye on that one. So lots happening. Let me end by telling you what GPE is doing. We have put $500 million, so $500 million of assistance into the marketplace, as I say, to help countries. The money is moving expeditiously. Nearly all of it has been approved. In general, it is being used to help countries keep children learning through different forms of distance learning, and also help reopen schools safely when it is time to do so. And the money will be, I think, completely deployed by early September. And you can go to our website to get much more information about what's going on there. While $500 million is a big amount of money, it is not nearly enough. And what happens next really matters for the next generation. GPE is squarely focused on this. We're doing our next strategic plan, GPE 2025, and it is focusing very much on how countries can recover from this crisis, which we think will not just be short-term, but will have medium and long-term impacts about the availability of good education. And we're also launching our next replenishment, which will be a 5-year replenishment and will occur next year. And it will also be very focused on helping countries get the resources they need to come back, and build back resilient education systems. So let me end there. And again, thank you. The answer is, I think we can't contemplate trade-offs. We have to contemplate how to do better.
Thank you very much, Alice. I think that's a very nice introduction to this conversation now. And I think the point that you just made, which I want to come back to in the subsequent discussion also, are the need to focus on how we can lean in and protect education spending. And I think everybody will want to do that. And the question will become how best we make a case for it, how we do that, because I'm sure, of course, many sectors, health, global health and health security and the climate, everybody's going to be asking for exactly that same protection at a time when the aggregate budgets are going to be shrinking. As you said, aid is likely to go down by 2 billion. National budgets are likely to be under pressure as growth rates actually slow down for a few years. And we know already the projections that we're seeing. So domestic resource mobilization will be under pressure. And then how do we manage that? I think the role of EdTech and distance learning and just how feasible that's going to be in a lot of countries and how we can scale it up, because as you pointed out, in so many countries today, we don't have the infrastructure backbone, right, in terms of IT. So the current number of people that are actually kids that are reached through distance learning using technology is quite small in Africa. And the question is how we can make that more than a niche product. And then this issue of doing it better, using the money, whatever amount you spend, kind of ensuring that it gets to the front line and it delivers outcomes. Because as we said at the beginning of this, we still had a huge learning challenge with 80% of children not being able to read and write well at the age of 10. So I think those, you put some squarely very important issues on the table. And I want to turn to Rose, if I may, to you, to sort of get a little bit of a sense of how you see it from a national perspective. As Alice said, Rwanda was one of the countries that moved very quickly. I think you closed your schools in the middle of March when you just had 1 or 2 cases as a very assertive, aggressive measure to try and control the spread of COVID. Now a lot of children have been out of school for a while, and you must be thinking and being concerned about what this means, and also about how you're going to make that case in terms of ensuring that education is protected, and how you're preparing for what happens if the budget doesn't grow as much as you had anticipated before. I mean, what are the choices you're going to have to make? So can I turn to you, please?
Thank you very much for having this opportunity, and on behalf of Honorable Minister Dr. Valentine Wamaria, she was supposed to be here with you today, but she couldn't managed to be here due to reasons out of our control. So for us in Rwanda, first of all, we acknowledge the support from GPE. The CEO mentioned that Rwanda was the first country to have the grants. So we had the 10 million support with the help of World Bank. World Bank has been so supportive. World Bank is our grant agent for this particular grant for COVID support in schools. So we are grateful to that, and we have started anyway working on how to make sure that schools are safe when we open schools in September. So as you mentioned, we had the first case in Rwanda on 14th March, and immediately schools closed. It was a Saturday, so next on a Monday, there was no students in schools. For those who are day schools who are supposed to go to school, so immediately we closed schools and we started evacuating boarding students. And that was not an easy job in 3 days to evacuate all boarding students in the country, and it was done under the ministry itself. So it was not really easy for us, but it was necessary because their health, their well-being is the most important thing to us. So coming back to what does it mean to Rwanda? What does it mean to our government and the education system in general? So there's a lot that has been going on. They will stay at home for 6 months, from March to September, and we are not sure yet if September will still be safe, because with the trend, we don't know what will happen, but for now, we are planning for September. So what will be the major things that we are focusing on? The first and the biggest concern to us is health and well-being of students and teachers. If we open schools in September, we need to ensure that, okay, these schools are safe in case we know the trend worldwide, everyday cases, new cases every day. So how do we ensure that students are safe? Do we have enough hand washing facilities, for example, because we need to wash hands? What about social distancing? The government of Rwanda has invested so much to help at least students and teachers and all of us to reduce overcrowding in classrooms. So in these few months up to September, the government have committed to build over 22,000 new classrooms to make sure that in September, the students are safe. At least we don't have that much overcrowding. So that is really important to us. And issues like screening, maybe, as you know, when they go back to school, there's still some cases. How do we make sure that we trace really early screening of the temperature? If we need masks, for example, if children have to go to school and masks are one of those things, like right now, it's a law. We all have to wear a mask. I'm not wearing it right now, but when we go to public, we have to. What if students have to go back with masks? What will happen? So we are working on those calculations and to see what can we do and what can partners do, but also educating them and circulating messages. But not just the health, because if they go back to school, then we'll be looking at where are these kids? Did we get everybody back to school? As you mentioned, maybe we find some children, especially girls, teenage pregnancies or some dropout. So what we're working on is to have a back to school program campaign to make sure that everybody is going back to school, mostly focusing on girls and learners with disabilities who have been having different problems within this period, where others are learning remote learning, TV and radio programs, but to them it has been very difficult depending on what they need to make them learning. But again, we are thinking of catch-up programs so that we make sure that if students have spent all these 6 months, are they able to come back and then continue where they were? So some of them have been able to follow have been able to learn during this school closure in remote learning, but there are others who will not be able, like in remote areas where there's no internet, some don't have TV. So how do we make sure that when we open schools, they're all at the same pace? And we have to do that assessment to see that, to make sure that they're the same. What can we do to make sure that they get at par with others? Another big thing that we are focusing on again, and also engaging our partners, is on resilience. As CEO of GPE talked about, we've been hearing or learning from other countries. Last time we had the Sierra Leone uh, experience of Ebola, where they had to close schools for the whole year. But for now, they built some kind of resilience. Now it's not really hard, like some of us who are experiencing this for the first time. So what are the lessons learned? Strengthening our remote learning, the e-learning platforms, the TV and radio programs, supporting the vulnerable groups where they don't have internet, electricity, devices. If we go back to school, maybe we're now thinking about the blended learning, which has not been there. We are just used to the traditional teaching and learning, teach in front of classroom. But now with COVID-19, we have learned a lot of lessons, and we have seen where we need to put much effort, especially on remote learning. But also, there's another aspect of teaching and learning materials, because they are at home, but if they don't have enough textbooks or other books, that reference books, they'll not be able to learn. So we are investing much more on teaching and learning materials, so that wherever you are, you can have your books, you can have your reference materials, together with the e-learning platforms and the TV and radio programs. They can learn anywhere they are. And on the side of nutrition, and I think you talked about, Masood, you talked about malnutrition when they come back to school. They have, so the government has introduced a new program, scaling up the school feeding program. In Rwanda, we had it, but it was specifically for higher levels, like in secondary schools. But now we've decided, starting September, we are going down from pre-primary, primary, those kids who really need to be fed well to avoid malnutrition. So the government has invested much on that particular area. So we are starting with providing the food stuff, but to those schools, like primary schools, where they don't have kitchens, they don't have equipment for the school feeding program to be successful. So we are starting by building those kitchens, providing cooking equipment, so that we make sure that September they get food at school, and this will help them at least to follow up and follow their classes and concentrate. So we have a number of things that we're focusing on, but I just picked a few of them, and on teachers, of course, to help them at least in the CPD and trainings, so that they also don't get that negative impact from COVID. As we're looking to students, we're also focusing on teachers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. So I mean, your comments give one a sense of the sort of enormity and range of things that national leadership in the education sector has to be dealing with right now. Everything from how do you ensure that you can actually get kids back into school safely in September. How do you make sure that once they're there, they're healthy, and that you deal with the issues around nutrition? Because a lot of teenage girls were getting uh, iron and vitamin A supplements during the school year and at school, and now they've missed it this year. So a whole range of nutrition issues around that you have to deal with. And then thinking about longer term questions in terms of how does all this change the way we think about building resilience into the education sector in ways that are take us away from the traditional model. And I want to come back to that in terms of how we can start thinking about some of those issues going forward. Uh, I'd like to turn now, if I may, to Susanna. Susanna, I know you and other members of the education team at CGD have been looking at the experience from past crises and looking at what are likely to be some of the big issues and challenges and trends that are going to emerge from this. And I wanted to get a little bit your take on what those issues are that would then help us also set the frame for a conversation amongst all of us going forward. So your thoughts on this, please, Sana.
Thank you, Masood. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today alongside Alice and Rose and Heini, and obviously with the boss moderating. And it's really humbling in particular to hear from Rose just how many challenges and how many things you're having to deal with in Rwanda. And it makes me feel like my job is less challenging in comparison. I wanted, I guess, to mention 6 things that I think we're learning from the pandemic that might sort of potentially be big shifts in the education sector in the next few years. A few of them have been mentioned by Rose and by Alice, so I'll sort of skate quite quickly over those ones. First of all, talking about education finance, which Alice talked quite a bit about. My colleagues and I looked back at what happened to education finance in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis. And what we saw was that education spending in high and even low income countries was quite well cushioned, although we did have some questions about the data in low income countries. But in low middle income countries, that's where we really saw big dips in education spending, both in terms of education as a share of the budget and in absolute levels. And that seems like a real risk going forwards that we should be prepared with. Alongside that, we're probably going to be having, as Alice said, dips in aid money, and education is going to have quite a struggle to negotiate to keep its share of that aid budget, particularly in the wake of the health crisis. And then also household spending is likely to dip, given the economic shocks that households are facing at the moment. So I think I really applaud the Save Our Futures campaign that the education sector is building at the moment. But I guess I take a slightly different perspective to Alice respectfully here, in that I do think we should also be prepared to think about trade-offs at the same time as hoping they won't have to be made. So I fully support advocating to maintain education budgets and to increase education budgets, because we know that's needed if we want to achieve SDG 4. But equally, I do think we have to have some hard conversations about, where the compromises are and where we don't think we can make compromises. Secondly, I wanted to talk about access and enrolment and children out of school. And we've made huge gains as a sector in getting children into school over the last 10 years. And it seems unfortunate that in the wake of the COVID pandemic, as Rose and Alice both alluded to, we may well see steps back in that respect. And looking in particular at countries that are projected to suffer sort of the largest economic shocks and already have high numbers of children out of school, they would be the countries I would be most concerned about. So countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, Niger, Chad, Liberia, Sierra Leone, countries that have high numbers or high percentages of kids out of school already and that are projected to suffer the worst of the economic crisis. What we also know, again, as others have alluded to, is that it's likely to be the poorest kids, the most vulnerable kids who will suffer most and are least likely to return to school. So girls may enter into early marriage and boys may be forced into the labour market. And I think being ready to tackle those challenges right now is really important. Thirdly, talking about EdTech, I think that we've all had high hopes for EdTech before the pandemic, during, and many people still have them. It's not clear to me that EdTech is yet living up to that hype. If you look at the sort of household access data, about 20% of households in low and low middle income countries have access to the internet, and only about 50% have access to TV and radio. The big EdTech firms in Africa, the 2 biggest, I believe, are Eneza Education and Ubongo Education, are only reaching around 1 million users. So that's really a very tiny percentage of the children that need their products. And I think what we still haven't learned very much about EdTech is the extent to which children can use tech and can learn from tech without that human interaction. So we at CGD are really pleased to be working in Sierra Leone with the government and rising academies to evaluate what happens if you supplement radio broadcasts with teacher tutorials. So teachers are phoning students every week, and we hope that might kind of increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the radio broadcast. So I think there's lots to learn about EdTech, and I do think, as Alice says, that we should be thinking about how do we scale EdTech up equitably and quickly, given what we think might happen in the future, but it's really not clear to me that it's yet fit for purpose. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is inequality, which I'm sure we all agree was a huge challenge before the pandemic, and it's likely to be even worse afterwards. If we think about distance learning programs, first of all, many countries in Africa are quite slow to launch their distance learning programs. So Ghana, for example, launched theirs on June the 15th. And while most countries do now have some kind of program, children went for many months without access to any kind of government-led distance learning program. And we know that children from the richer households were likely to be accessing technology through their internet access, whereas poorer children were likely not to be. We've also seen from really good analysis, for example, by colleagues at RTI, Benjamin Piper and colleagues at IADB, that learning loss is likely to disproportionately affect the poorest kids. So IADB analysis suggests that poor kids during the summer holidays lose learning while rich kids gain learning. So you can kind of see that gap is widening even during the summer holidays. And given that kids have been out of school now for 4, 5, 6 months or more, then I think we should all be very worried about that, and particularly worried about the kids who are at the lower end of the distribution already. Then I wanted to talk a bit about high stakes exams. So high stakes exams are quite a hot topic in education. They're sort of, in many countries, the primary leaving exam or the matric exam are sort of hugely important national institutions. And it's sort of fairly clear that even at the best of times, high stakes exams aren't very fair. You get kids who've had a very different primary education, very different access to supplementary tuition, for example, and learning materials. They all then sit the same exam and get filtered into secondary schools or not into school at all on the basis of that one exam. If we look at SES data that my colleague Justin Sandifer analysed from PISA, obviously richer countries there's a very strong correlation between socioeconomic status and test scores. So if you layer onto that the fact that kids have been out of school during the pandemic and have had differential access to learning during that time, making children sit the exams this year seems incredibly unfair. And I really hope one sort of long-term trend from this pandemic may be that countries reconsider the role of high stakes exams in their education systems. And then finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the private sector, again, a sort of hot and controversial topic in education. We've seen headlines from countries, India, Pakistan, Peru, Kenya, that the private sector is really struggling at the moment. So that's understandable. They're not receiving fees from parents. They may not be receiving subsidies from governments. And it's likely that some may go out of business. It's also likely that given the economic shocks that households are facing, that parents will choose to send their kids to public schools when schools reopen, or they may choose to invest differently in their children's education. So for example, they may choose to send their girls to public schools and their boys to private schools. So all that's to say that I think we could potentially see, particularly in areas where there's a high proportion of private schools, I'm thinking about the large urban areas in South Asia and Africa in particular, we may well see some quite significant shifts in the education market equilibrium, with more and more kids trying to enroll in public schools, private schools going out of business, and a real strain on the public sector that I think we should be prepared for. So I'll stop there and look forward to other comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zara. You've certainly given us a very comprehensive 6-point, at least, agenda. And within the 6, there's actually subpoints that we can also explore. But before we get into them, I think this is a good time, Jaime, if I could bring you in. You know, you've sort of listened to the perspectives from Alice, from Rose, from Susanna. World Bank, of course, is a very big player in international financing for education, but more than financing, it's actually also a center for thinking about some of the trends and challenges that we're all grappling with. And I know you personally have been very much a champion of focusing on on this issue of learning poverty and how we can get at the younger ages, children better equipped to be able to read and write by the age of 10 at least, which is a good benchmark then for their subsequent learning and developing their full potential. You've also been, as the leader of the education practice of the World Bank, thinking about how that is how you're going to make that case for continuing to have the bank focus on education in its operational work in terms of the financing that the bank does. And I'm sure right now your colleagues in the bank are very busy putting out projects and programs to support the immediate consequences of the pandemic in terms of the health sector. But everybody in the bank is also very busy thinking about what comes next. So I wanted to get a little bit your sense on the issues that have been raised, on whether the learning poverty focus can and how it should be maintained and protected, and also how you see the bank as a whole stepping up now in terms of support for education going forward. So if I turn to you.
Thank you very much, Masood. I mean, and you have made several questions that could be for a couple of hours speaking. But let me just focus on a few points. The first one is, as you said, we were already living a learning crisis, right? We had introduced this indicator of learning poverty, right? The percentage of kids who could not read and understand the text by age 10. And that number was 53% before this crisis. And actually, what I like of the phrase learning poverty is that is an indicator that eventually should be zero, right? Learning poverty should be zero because all kids should be able to read and understand the text by age 10, right? It says we're not asking a lot there, right? It's kind of a minimum for all our education systems. And unfortunately, the number by before the crisis implied that about half of the kids would not able even to do that. And of course, the situation today is more complicated. The baseline is more challenging, and the inequality of those outcomes is even larger across countries and within countries, right? So obviously, we are in a really tough situation. And Rose, Alice, Susanna, they have, I mean, provided several aspects of the challenge, but I really want to emphasize that the magnitude of this twin shock that we're living is immense, right? This is the largest shock that the education world has lived in the last century, at least, right? We have never had these two shocks at the same time: extended school closure and at the same time deep economic recessions. I mean, all countries have faced the two things at some point in their histories, right? That's not uncommon, but we have never faced the two shocks at the same time, and we have never faced them simultaneously in all the world, right? So this is really an incredibly large shock to education, and to give a few, I mean, this is sometimes where one gets dizzy with the numbers, but I wanted to highlight another estimation that we have done about how can this be impacting the future of the children of this generation who is being impacted by the pandemic, is that in our calculations, in an intermediate scenario of 5 months of school closure, that might not be at this stage we're seeing that necessarily, it's even that might be a little bit optimistic at this stage, right? In many countries. So with 5 months of closure and an intermediate level of mitigation through remote learning, which let me discuss a little bit later, because of this interruption, if we don't do anything substantive when we come back to school, right? Each one of those children and young person will be losing $16,000 of lifetime earnings. That implies losing a loss for this generation of $10 trillion, which is about 8% of GDP, right? So it's an immense loss for this generation, who at the same time is the generation who will be paying the debt that many countries are incurring in order to finance their fight against the pandemic. as part of this potential negative outcome, I mean, why is that happening? Is because there might be learning losses, right? But also because the dropout rates could go up. Our estimations is about 7 million children not going back to school. Save the Children have just had other set of information that is talking about 10 million children not going back to school, right? So I think a big challenge, and sorry for this was my introduction, but sorry to make it long, is that it's important that we all internalize the magnitude of this crisis. And an important thing is that it's not only the education community that has to internalize the magnitude of this crisis, but it's actually the macro financial community, right? And society in general that has to internalize this potential shock that will happen. Now, I'm really worried, and Susanna mentioned that, about the inequality that this is generating. And why is that? Because the truth is that all countries are not staying still, right? Countries are doing a lot of stuff, right? And Rose mentioned and explained many of the things that Rwanda is doing. And we do have about 130 school systems who are implementing different combinations of interventions of remote learning to try to reach as many children as they can. But however, those efforts are hampered by logistical, by financing, by family challenges. So the effectiveness is not the same across countries, and the effectiveness is not the same within countries and different families, right? So as Rwanda is doing, many countries are doing multi-platform strategies, combining online with radio, TV, smartphones in order to reach children, and smartphones for the ministry to communicate with teachers. So countries are trying to do that, but obviously, right? I mean, say in sub-Saharan Africa, only 10% of kids will have internet at home or less. Even in middle-income countries in Latin America, that number is not more than 50%, right? So actually, most kids or many kids will only get radio or TV, right? And it's only a few hours, right? And some will have support at home, right? Because of parents that will I mean, help in that education engagement. Others might not, right? So the experience of different children will be extremely different, right? And so the potential inequality that this can generate is brutally high. Now, what to do, right? And just let me mention one of the things that you mentioned as well in the introduction, is that we'll need to build in resilience in the system. And why we need to build in resilience? Because this is going to be with us for some time. There's a huge uncertainty, right? Rose will say, we expect to come back in September in Rwanda, but we only expect it. Though that might change. We don't know. And it's a very complex social and political decision, right? Extremely complicated decision. But whenever that happens, we might open and then you might have to close, right? And the opening is going to be partial. It's going to be some grades, some schools, some children, less hours. So this resilience will require reopening a school without walls. And Rose was said it correctly. It's a school in which children can learn anywhere and anytime. We will have to explore how to assure continuity in the learning process between the school and the home. Right now, that sounds nice. That's part of the features that we want for the school of the future, right? Future that is not the future of 10 years from now. It's a future that has been propelled to today. But that's not going to be easy, right? And that school that will require that continuity needs certain elements, right? That we need to put in place very quickly. One is that education, and that's one of the lessons of this crisis, is a social experience. Education requires the teacher, right? I think for parents is very clear now that teachers is absolutely critical. However, teachers will have to navigate and acquire the skills for remote learning, right? Which is a challenge, right? It's a challenge. It's a challenge that we knew that existed in the past. Now it's a much more urgent challenge. So teachers need clear guidelines and continued support to learn how to teach effectively in this new reality. Second, what is something that I was already saying, we need to talk about multi-platform strategies, right? Yes, ideally, we should be closing the digital divide. Ideally, everyone should have access online because that will be more efficient, but that will take some time. In the meantime, we need urgently to continue working with this that combination of radio, TV, online, and using social networks, WhatsApp, right? And as Susanna was saying, for instance, combining, I mean, if you combine delivering content and broadcasting content through radio and TV, but then accompanying that, right, that through social networks you can provide guidance to teachers, right, in order to use better, right, that content that is broadcasted, then you are leveraging those two technologies, right? Something that, of course, we're learning now how to do that, right? These are not proven methods. So we'll need to learn and we need to continue to evaluate. Third, we need to have a curriculum that is streamlined and that it focuses on foundational learning. That's absolutely critical. So that the resilience, right, is just one of the elements that we need to look at in this process of coming back to school, right, and trying to make sure that there will be a continuity of the learning of the learning process. And finally, we need to have something that is more equitable, right? That has to be obsession of all countries. And being more equitable now would imply being more equitable at school and at home, right? So if we need at school, we need to work that all schools, right, will have then either the connectivity or the right support to teachers and the right inputs, but also we'll need to move towards a system in which at home kids will have, first of all, books, right? I mean, books are still part of our life, so we need to work on that issue. Eventually, that kids will be able to connect at least through a smartphone, right? So there has to be a set of policies that reduce inequality at school and reduce inequality in terms of the education experience at home. And let me close with the issue of financing. And there are several other points that I would like to make. I'll make them later. But one issue on the financing side is the following: is that yes, we need to protect and most likely expand expenditures per capita. And that is a homework of all the players in the education world. On the international side, yes, there will be pressures. We have to make the case internally in institutions like the bank, for instance, in order to expand expenditures in education. I mean, we are in a very good trend. I mean, last year only, I mean, the World Bank had its record of grants and lending on education with $5.2 billion for low and middle income countries. That's the largest number that we have seen, despite the fact that obviously this last year that just closed 2 weeks ago, this fiscal year that just closed 2 weeks ago, obviously the expansion in health, right, was dramatic, right? Particularly the last 4 months, right? But in that context, with health expenditures and health credits and loans are going up very quickly for obvious reasons. In the case of education, that number reached $5.2 billion, right? And we expected that in the next 12 months, I mean, for COVID only, right, there will be between $2 and $2.5 billion, right, going just not to all the operations in education, but to operations that are related to the pandemic. But actually, what matters is not matters what the World Bank says, right? Because all those decisions are decisions that are taken with the governments. So actually, what is critical is the prioritization of governments, both in terms of their of international resources, but much more important is what happens with domestic resources, right? I mean, 98% of expenditures in education in low and middle income countries comes from domestic resources, do not come from international resources, right? International resources can help, can support countries, can leverage reforms, but the bulk of the expenditures is domestic resources. So there we do have the work of protecting, but it's just not a statement, right? That protecting and expanding expenditures have to come with a clear plan, right, in terms of how those resources are going to be spent in order to get this resilience that I was mentioning, I mean, we'll have to come with a huge effort, and that's something that worries us in terms of the quality of the of those expenditures and the implementation and management capacity at the country level to spend each time better. And third, it has to come with an improvement of the markets of the many things that the education sector buys. The education sector buys many things. It buys tablets, it buys software, it buys books, and procurement of all those inputs, right, is extremely complex. Right, procurement of software is very complex. Right, the software market is a market that requires much more information. Is a market that has to be thickened, right, in which the buyers have to be much better prepared in order to engage and know what, when, and how to buy. We have huge issues of pricing of software and of internet connection. So there is a lot of work that we need to do in terms of improving the efficiency of those markets, both at the international and at the local level. Huge task. However, one thing that I just wanted to close with is saying that change is possible, right? I think that many of the investments that countries are doing today, for instance, as part of these remote learning strategies, can be that launch pad, right, for a better system that is more resilient, that is more equitable, right? So that change is possible. I like to sometimes mention the case of Egypt, right, in which there's a huge transformation with much more use of technology, with a change in mindsets about what education is about. But it's a change that is envisaged that has to happen in a few years, not in a few decades, right? Sometimes one say, well, changes in education take a long time. Yes, well, they are not overnight, true, right? But they don't have to take decades. They can take years. But let me stop there. Huge homework, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much, Masoud.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that what you've just done, at least when I was listening to you, I was thinking that you're really painting a vision of a complete transformation in a way of the way in which we organize the whole process of education in low and middle income countries to reflect not just the sort of immediate consequences of this crisis, but in terms of the learnings from it, of how you go to a different model, which doesn't rely on the sort of bricks and mortar and the building as being the defining place within which education takes place. We use multiple media to reinforce the learning process and and also underpinning all this, it does seem to me there is an, an assumption that there will be a commensurate increase in connectivity in different ways in those societies to enable it to happen. And yet, then there's the starting point. And the starting point is that you have an education sector that in many countries is still very traditional in the way in which it delivers services. Uh, you have a lot of the money that is spent in education that is actually uh, not discretionary in the sense that it's all tied up primarily in sort of maintenance teachers' salaries, and that kind of uses up the bulk of the system. Uh, you have at least a perception in some countries that the openness to this kind of radical change in the sector has not been something that has characterized it in the past. So it's a mindset change, not only in the consumers, if you like, but in the suppliers of the services that has to happen. And it's also a transformation that, as I said, requires the use of a lot more technology of different kinds than we've done in the past. So that's kind of one vision of where we want to go. And what you've also said is that actually we don't really have a very single clear pathway that says this is the way we're going to go to that vision. There's going to be a lot of experimentation across countries, and we'll learn from the experimentation. So that's one challenge. And then the other thing that you said, which I want us to explore a little bit, is you pointed out that we have to make the case not only to people who are in the education field, but to finance ministers and macro trade-off economists. And finance ministers also need to be convinced that this vision that you're laying out of what needs to be done is worth investing in at a time when they have so many other pressing commitments that are going to be thrown at them. And I want to really get all of you to and maybe Rose, you're the best person to start off on this, is to give a sense of how do you square this need for people within the sector and in the rest of the community to buy into this transformation that is required and embark on this transformation, because that's what's needed to deliver the kinds of learning that we are talking about, and not just learning but also the social aspects that of being in the education system you talked about, and at the same time give enough confidence to the people you're asking for funding that you can actually make enough progress to deliver on this transformation in a way that you're not just going to be asking for funding to do the thing that you yourself are saying are no longer going to be delivering the kinds of outcomes you want. So how do you see this challenge ahead of you? I mean, you're going to be preparing your submission, if you like, to the Treasury in Rwanda, and you have to make this case. And I want to get a little bit your sense, and then that ask other colleagues to chip in.
Sure, it's not easy for the treasury itself, because I think we mentioned at some point education will be requesting for some funds, agriculture will come, and other sectors will come too. But the assurance we have is, I think, the spirit uh, within the sector itself, so education sector, but within the communities themselves. I'll give you an example of what we started doing, like building the classrooms. So it's not a normal way of building classrooms with all the procurements and engineers and all those people. Yes, we'll need them, the engineers and everybody, but the spirit that everybody is concerned about education, and that's why we're using the conventional way of building these classrooms. So you would say, how can you, within very few months, do that? Of course, it's not just the education sector, so everybody will be involved, not just the Ministry of Education, but finance, development partners. You see everybody getting involved. So it's kind of collective effort, and because we will never have enough funds, not from the government, not from donors, but how do we make sure that we own this kind of efforts that we are putting on? So everybody will be involved, because we know economically we've been affected everywhere. We're in crisis, but education, I always mention that education needs to be given a special consideration. As you talked about during your opening, that the impact might not be seen today, but it can be seen in longer term. So we really need to invest in that. And that's why when you're talking about, when you're asking for people to come and help us, they also come in, and we really make sure that we implement what we agreed to implement. I'll give you an example of the COVID-19 support from the GPE with the support of the World Bank. We're pioneering it. They're really helping us doing it right now. So people are working their hearts out right now, even if we don't have the money today, all of the money today, but at least we make sure that we start and make sure that September the kids are safe and they can start their school.
Thank you very much, Rose. Alice, any thoughts on this challenge that Jaime's kind of placed before us?
Sure. Yes, and thank you. And I very much have enjoyed listening to everybody and share thoughts. So a couple of things to reflect on. First of all, I think that if I were to generalize, the ministers are already demanding change. Even before COVID, we've been in close touch with many of the ministers who are ministers of education within GPE on our board with whom we work, because we're in the middle of a strategic planning process. And they have sent a number of aid memoirs that to the board and to others that have said we can no longer have business as usual, and they're looking for a much more transformative agenda. So I think that in many ways, the appetite for change is there, accelerated, of course, with COVID. I do think on some of the procurement issues and sort of delivery procurement issues, we can learn from other sectors. For example, Gavi in the health sector has really made fantastic progress in all the kind of thinking and around bulk purchasing of vaccines that has enabled the price to go down, to the R&D process to be shortened, and it's enabled a more efficient use of the finance that they have had. So, for example, when the education sector thinks about tablets and broadband and some of the kit needed for education, perhaps there are some things that we can learn from other sectors. I do think that as a sector, we are probably underutilizing partnerships. There are clear partnerships with other sectors that are absolutely going to be vital, and the three that are top of mind for us are agriculture, because of the nutrition issues and feeding programs. Rose, what you've talked about, I think resonates. Connectivity. A number of the countries that have requested funding from GPE are wanting to enter into partnerships with telecoms and other providers of connectivity to lower the price. That's something that I think of access. That's something that I think we could look at on a more wholesale basis, if you will, across the sector. Connectivity for education ought to be free, period, the end. And then I think the other thing that we are not leaning into enough is innovative finance. Other sectors have made more progress on innovative finance. That's not to say that it's a magic wand that is all of a sudden going to, change the amount of financial availability from where we are now to something significantly different overnight. But we have underinvested in innovative finance. And I think that there's a lot that we can do there. It is going to require a change of mindset about how we deliver, who the partners are, what are the metrics, and things of that nature. But these are things that I think we can begin to work on one by one to begin to really put some meat on the bones of the vision that I think Jaime, Rose, and Susanna have outlined. So there are definitely some steps that we can take.
Thank you, Alice. That's really helpful. Susanna, any reactions from you to not just what Jaime said, but what Rose and Alice have commented?
Thank you. It's been great listening to all these perspectives. I think we have a huge challenge on our hands at the moment. If you look at the projections that the Education Commission made in terms of the money that's needed to achieve SDG 4, and you look at the challenge that we have and the money that we're likely to have, it seems like there's a huge gap that you could sail a steamliner between. And to take your question to heart, Masood, about how do we talk to finance ministers about this, I think we have to look at sort of what are the big levers that we can use to save money domestically and globally, and thinking about what costs money in domestic education budgets. Teacher salaries are a huge part of that, and I'm not suggesting that we reduce teacher salaries, but there are thinking about teacher allocation, thinking about class sizes. Are there ways that we can try to make education budgets leaner and more efficient in that way? Because that does seem like sort of the class size and teacher salary levers seem like the main ones to me that can potentially be used to sort of get more for your money, if you like, at domestic level. So yes, I'll stop there because I know that we're short of time and I'm keen to hear Jaime's perspective, but I do think that sort of serious conversations about trade-offs are really needed.
Yes, no, I think, we will have, the question is, we'll have to have those choices being made, and I guess the real choice we have is, do we make the choices after a conversation that looks at the pros and cons of what's the best way to spend money, or we find that it just happens ad hoc and then we discover the choices we've made ex post, and clearly the first is better. Jaime, any thoughts on this issue? And then I want to ask you, actually, maybe you could also say a little bit about a lot of what you have all talked about in terms of the next phase of this as we transition from a world where, and I'm simplifying this, but schools were the levelers, the equalizers. You were able to bring progressively people from marginalized, less advantaged backgrounds into the school system. That's the whole agenda for moving enrollment out. It's agenda for ensuring education is affordable, and then you provide other things at school which help to compensate for the disadvantages that some kids have given the background at home in terms of nutrition, in terms of protection, in terms of uh, and now we're going to a more physically disaggregated model. A lot more of the kids' learning will happen outside a common place in the vision that you have. And a lot of it will rely on their ability to benefit from this disaggregated learning model by both having the facilities, and that's we've been talking about connectivity, but also having a home environment and the daily pressures, if you like, the choices that enable them to focus on spending the time and have the support to do the learning rather than go and do a day's work or do something else that take childcare responsibilities for their younger siblings or whatever else that they are under pressure to do. And you could just see all of this panning out in terms of a widening of inequalities after many decades of an effort to try to narrow those inequalities through the education system. And we'll get to a point at some point when we'll have the connectivity universally and everybody will have equal access. And if you think about it, people who have disabilities, for example, right now, and that's another group of people that'll be much more hard pressed to take advantage of the system. So I'm quite worried about sort of where this leads over the next decade in terms of a reversal of the efforts to narrow inequalities in educational opportunities and and go from there. And I wanted to get a little bit of your sense of, is that just something that one accepts as inevitable and you sort of say, this is, we don't have, we'll do the best we can, but that's the outcome? Do you make that one of the primary objectives, which is we will need to do this in ways that don't widen inequality, even if it slows down the rollout of our new vision? We will make that trade-off. How do you make that choice, if you like? How do you, and of course each country will make its own choice, but what guidance would we be able to provide to people on how to think about the risk of widening inequalities as a result of moving to this? So that's really what I wanted to get a little bit your initial take on, and then of others. But if you have anything that you wanted to add before that on the financing question, that'd be great too. Jaime, you're still on mute.
Okay, so no, just to react to your last point, to your last statement, I mean, yes, choices are made by countries, and inequality is a choice, right? It's not inevitable, right? We have seen it as something like it's extremely difficult to fight against. True, it's a formidable threat, right? But it's a choice, right? And we see there are countries in which inequality opportunity is much smaller than in other countries, right? So it's not that it's not possible to have a world or a country in which all children have a decent chance of getting a good education, all of them, right? That happens in many countries, right? So actually that's not impossible, right? Actually, the same thing that we were saying when talking about the learning poverty indicator. Well, learning poverty, it is close to zero in a few countries, not in many, but it is close to zero. So it's possible, right, to have a learning poverty equal to zero. Now, what we have to recognize is that unfortunately, the school system in most of the low and middle income countries have not been the equalizer that it should be, right? True, more kids are going to school, and that only is good, right? That sometimes people say yes, but they don't learn that much. Well, but education is not only about the academics. Education is the academics, but it's also a social experience. So the kids going to school, that's great, right? So that's to start with. So the fact that many countries have improved enrollment rates, that's a positive development. However, the heterogeneity in quality is so big, right, across countries and within countries, and it's even worse within countries, right, everywhere, including my country in Peru, right? That definitely we cannot say that school has been the leveler, right, that it should have been. Right now, how to see the future? Well, a few things. One, I'm not saying that that the school building is not important, right? It will be important, right, in the future, right? And actually, we're working with the Rwanda government now in building schools. So, I mean, that is really something that we're doing as we speak. So the bricks and mortar school, yes, it will matter. I mean, education is a social experience, right? A social experience that you will not have, even if you have perfect connectivity, you will not have it through a flat screen, right? You need to have that interaction, and a lot of the magic of learning happens in that interaction between the teacher and the student, right? And the student interacting with other people, right? Even more now that we say that the education process is not about providing information. The education process is about learning kids to reflect and think by themselves. It's about, I mean, fostering creative thinking and group thinking, right, and teamwork, right. So all those things, in to a large extent, are a social experience. So no, schools matter, right, and the building will matter. However, we need to work on in reducing inequality in those two dimensions, reducing inequality in the school, something that to a certain extent has happened, right? But obviously we are way off from where we should be. But actually, I mean, as you were saying, a lot of the education process happens at home, right? And there we see huge inequalities, right? In terms of stimulation at home, in terms of availability of books and basic reading material. So my sense is that we'll need to act upon that. We'll need to act upon that. I think this crisis has, I don't, it's kind of a slap in the face, right? Because there are many of these inequalities that already were there. The digital divide, for instance, right, which is this huge inequality that we're living today. We have been talking about the digital divide for 10 years, right? So now it's saying like, okay, you were talking about digital divide, you had a digital divide, well, there you go. Look what's happening because of your digital divide, right? So true. I mean, that will have to be closed. It will take a lot of time and effort, yes, right? But the technology to do that is there, right? So it's a lot of political will, and it's a lot of also financial commitment. Um, and let me close with the going back to the financial issue. I think the critical point is to see education as part of the social contract, right, of countries. When I was saying before is that 98% of the financing comes from domestic expenditures, right? Maybe a larger role of international resources for very poor countries, right? But for most of the countries, it's a good. The majority is domestic resources, and that doesn't come from heaven, right? That comes from taxes. It's very simple. It comes from taxes, right? And hence we need to be very clear that we put education right there in the middle of that social contract discussion, right? That this country X, and that applies to all countries. Well, we need to get our act together, right? And we need to collect more taxes, right? Everywhere, and obviously in a fair way, right? And be bold in terms of the reforms that are needed on our tax systems, including international transactions, um, in order to collect the resources, right? That will be needed. So I think that education is critical. That is part of that. That is part of that discussion, and that. Um, I think the challenge is not to see the budget discussion in terms of only the details for this year or for next year, but to say, so we as a country, right, if we're spending $500 per student today, is that enough? right? Well, you'll have some low-income countries in which that number is $200, right? Nigeria, it's probably less than that, right? And we don't even have good data, right, to be sure about the number. But compare that $200 per student with the average of 7,000 in OECD, right? So you need to say, look, that 200, it's unbearable, right? It's impossible that we're going to give a decent service to all our children with that month, with those 200. So what's the path? So we need to agree on the path. Yes, obviously we're not going to spend 5,000 tomorrow, of course, right? But what's the path, right? Of that 200. How will that move along the next few years, right? In order for us then to say, yes, we're creating the space in order to give a better experience to our students. So I think that financing discussion, right? I like much more the dollars per student than when we use numbers of percentages of GDP or percentages of something. I mean, I think much more concrete is you say, this is the number of dollars that you're spending per each kid, right? And countries have to see, well, where we are on that, right? And what's the path of that, right? That's obviously many decisions have to take in on the educational side in terms of how you structure the service that you're going to be delivering, right? But very unlikely that even if you're highly efficient, you're going to be able to give something high quality with $200 or even with 500, right? So, but things going to change from one day to the other. So that path has to establish as part of that discussion of a social contract.
I must say, I mean, I really, I mean, for what it's worth, I personally think that that's really important point you've just made, which is that we really have to have a conversation about a medium-term path and a medium-term vision of where you want to go and a path of getting there, and that conversation has to get out of the vicious circle where one side is saying if you only spend 200 you can't get what you need, and the other side is sitting there and saying look at within the 200 here's 5 things that you're spending which are a bad thing and you should stop spending it, and so it becomes a non-conversation, because really what we should be saying, as you say, is you can't really deliver good outcomes on learning for $200. You need to spend whatever, and that whatever has to be spent in this way, which may be different from the way in which we're spending it now. And part of the conversation is about how you move on that path on both sides in a joined up way. And I think that absence of the joined up conversation between the funding and the delivery has been sometimes an impediment for both sides to actually make a constructive way forward, and you get trapped into this sort of negative conversation which doesn't lead anywhere, because the end of it you're still spending only 200 and you're still spending not a bit as well as one could. So, and I think that that's the way to move it forward. Sorry, uh, Alice, I wanted to turn to you and Rose on this and then come back to Susanna also.
Well, thank you. I think that a lot of what folks have said in the last round, I think, has been very, very valuable. And Masood, your point about the delivery and the financing cannot be sort of disassociated with each other, I think is an absolutely vital part of what the next round of conversations look like. I have to say that there have been times where there's almost been sort of a conflict between what does delivery look like and what is finance. And it's almost been a negative to talk about those two things together, and in fact in some ways controversial. And I think that one of the points I was trying to make earlier on was that we have to open up this door on the question of efficiency. We have no choice. Efficiency and delivery. And I don't think that means that all of a sudden there's going to be huge decisions that we're not going to do X, but in order to progress in this environment, we've got to make much better decisions about delivery, cost of delivery, impact of cost of delivery, and then figure out what are the levers that need to be pulled in order to improve it. Connectivity, for example, being one of them, which is not widely available, but is obviously has to be part of the solution in some way. So I think that I'm hoping that we are entering into a very different set of conversations. Getting back to Masood, your question about what do you tell the finance minister? I think that for the finance ministers that I've spoken with, their main concern is effectiveness of spend and ability to deliver results. And I think that if we can begin as a community to put the pieces together to say, here's where we need to go, very much listen to countries. I mean, they've got some excellent views and ideas, and be able to say, this is the pathway, these are the results, this is the cost. It's not going to be a money saving exercise, but it's going to be a way to deliver a vision that we know is vitally necessary right now. So I think that in a way we have to look at the finance ministers as partners and really focus much more on quality of delivery and efficiency. And there's a lot to, I think there's a big agenda there, which is not something that we have talked about all that much in the past, but I think there's an enormous agenda there.
Absolutely. I think partnership rather than this kind of defensive adversarial relationship is the key to move it forward. Rose, I want to come to you, but can I also add a question that's come in on the live stream, which was raised earlier also, which is this issue of the exams this year. Do you think that, are you planning to scrap exams for this year in Rwanda, the high stakes exams? We're talking about the risk that they exacerbate inequality at a time when kids have been out of school. So if any thoughts on that along with the more general point?
So what we've done in Rwanda is we had a school year. I'll start with the last question. The school year used to start in January to December, so the calendar year. Now, we started in January this year, 2020, they started, but before even students finished their first term, they were interrupted. So what we are doing right now is when you go back to September, we are going to repeat, to restart that year. That means we are not going to have any exams for this year till we start afresh in September. Then all the assessments are going to be planned depending on the school calendar that is going to be developed. We of course have a draft, but it depends on the dates. When are we going to start? Then we can be able to count the weeks where students have to study and the assessments and the exams and national exams. So it's not like the exams are cancelled this year. It's just, it was an interruption and the school calendar was interrupted. And now we have to restart in September. So from September, we'll have that calendar. So going back to finance, delivery, and the impact of all the activities and the interventions that we have, we really have to, and that is what the ministry as a policy making organ, and we are in charge of monitoring and evaluation, following up. We have no choice but following up delivery. If we have this kind of finance, the government is providing money, of course, to help us see the impact of COVID, reduce the impact of COVID to education. Other partners are in the Global Partnership for Education and other partners that we have in Rwanda, like other countries. That's where we start down at the beginning, and we drafted a plan, school reopening plan and the contingency plan, so that this plan shows everything, the milestones and who is responsible and the budget and when should we report. So we really need to follow up. And in Rwanda, the performance-based contracts are really, really helpful, and we need to make sure. So there's no choice, and we need to see a positive impact, and that is at our level at the ministry. So it's obvious. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I'm attentive to that also, but I just want to say one thing on what you've just said, and we're kind of running out of time also, is that we've been talking about finance ministers being partners. We've been talking about education ministers, as Alice, you were saying, they're already asking for a transformatory approach. We've been talking about the international institutions, and many of you represent them here. But another group that we haven't spent much time on, and I'm not sure we have time today to do it, but it really is to think about teachers in all this. And teachers have to be central driver of this agenda, but also they have to be partners, not just individually, but collectively. And teachers' unions have to be part of the buy into that process of reform and the transformatory vision. And in some countries that's happening, and in other countries that's a harder challenge to bring the teachers union into that conversation in the same positive, as you were saying, Alice, the partnership approach, rather than to think of it as in some ways a threat to a way of doing business. So that's also part of the agenda. And I want to just ask each of you, if you, starting Susanna with you, if you could have reflect on any final thoughts before we close out. I'm afraid we're running out of time there. Susanna.
Yeah, I guess sort of three things that my fellow panelists have said have really stuck with me. So Jaime saying that inequality is really a choice, I think is something that we have to all take seriously and think about as the education sector in every decision that we make, and that's going to stick with me. I think Alice saying that the appetite for change is really there before the pandemic and during the pandemic and after the pandemic. It is super important, and we have to think about how we kind of leverage that situation and that appetite for reform to try to make things better in what's going to be sort of very challenging times ahead. And then I guess I hate to end on a sort of negative note, but Rose's contributions have been really eye-opening for me, as I said before, extremely humbling, and just sort of understanding quite how much you're doing every day to try to make schools safe for your children. But when you said we never have enough money, that was the case before the pandemic. It's probably always going to be the case. So figuring out, as Alice and you and Jaime have all said, how do we make delivery as effective and as efficient as possible? Let's not detach it from the money. Let's talk about it, have really honest, transparent conversations about it. So yes, I sort of thank my fellow panelists, because you've given me sort of very, very important things to take away and think about.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Jaime, any final thought?
So very quickly, one is I just want to balance things out, right? In the sense that, yes, it's always about efficiency, but in education, given where most of the low income and middle income countries are, improving efficiency will never be enough, right? If I were spending $6,000 per student, probably my story will be different if I'm spending 300. Right, so it's both things. Yes, of course. I mean, you need to be extremely efficient, but that will make it only. Second, the other balance is between technology and teachers. Right, we have mentioned several times that yes, we'll need to close the digital divide. We need to expand faster in terms of having technology available at school and at home. Right, but I'm not saying that implies less use of the human factor. It's exactly the opposite, right? It's a balance. Is probably the future meeting tomorrow, actually, not the future in 10 years, is about combining the right way technology with the human factor, is using technology to enhance the effectiveness of the work of the teacher, right? But without the teacher, you won't have, right, a good education experience. And my final point is that I would I don't know what's the right word. I mean, caveat a little bit the point that there is appetite for change. I think there is, but it's extremely heterogeneous, right? It's much. I mean, though everyone says the right words, right? In terms of yes, we need to reform education. Education is clear. It's extremely important for the development process, etc. All politicians, all ministers will say the right things. Even the minister of finance will always say the right things. However, that's not enough, right? I mean, it is actually that political, not only financial, but political commitment, right? To do not only the right investments, but the tough and harsh decisions that are needed in order to do the transformation that we need. That I would say it's much less common, right? It's something that we really need to continue insisting, right, and working, right? People who are like us in the education community have to be much more effective, right, in making the case to society as a whole, not to make the case within the education community. That's preaching to the converted, right? It's to make the case of society as a whole. That is something that still there's a real huge homework to be finalized. We do see political commitment in some countries. Yes, we do. right? And we do find leaders, right, who are really committed to make the tough and complicated decisions, but we don't see that everywhere, right? And sometimes it's something that also you need continuously a long time, right? And that's the other challenge that many of our societies face, that sometimes you see a lot of commitment but then dies out because there's a political change, right? So that's not never a linear process, but I mean, but that's the homework that we have, and that's tough, but nobody said that public policy is easy.
Thank you very much, Javi. Alice, you have your minute.
Thank you very much. So let me just end on 2 points. On the question of teachers, teachers are an absolutely vital part of what the solution looks like. And in my personal view, I think they ought to be deemed essential workers if they not, and be given all the access to vaccines when there is one, PPE, masks, and so forth, so that they are able to get back into the schools and be part of the solution to open safely. So, and in addition to thinking about some of the delivery challenges that we've talked about over the course of the morning. In terms of other vital partners, I'm going to put head of state on the list. And we need to reach out to finance ministers, to teachers unions, to parents, to communities, but we also have to make a case to heads of state to invest in education. And when heads of state decide to really lean into education, good things happen. So I think, for example, about President Bio in Sierra Leone, who, well before COVID, had made education a critical part of his presidency, and he and his government are continuing to take some very brave decisions about how to even recently sort of continue to change the policy environment so pregnant girls can go back to school after this is all over with. So we need to continue to make the case. Jaime is absolutely right in the sense that there is political change, but to me, it's an opportunity to go and visit with the head of state and make the case again. And so if we can bring together all the sectors that are, or all the critical partners that are sort of outside of the immediate people that we work with, and strongly make the case about political will, about financing, about connectivity, about different ways of using technology across a range of spectrum of choices of technology, get the community involved, and make this a long game priority, I think that we can begin to make some progress. It's not going to be overnight, but given what we've seen in terms of how vulnerable education is, we've seen it like this, it goes away like this, we have no choice but to lean into it in this manner.
Thank you very much, Alice. Rose, you have the last word.
So thank you very much. To me, the main concern now is building resilience. As I said, we are planning to start in September, but we never know. Whatever maybe in September, October, November, we are supposed to, maybe we are required to take back students home. So what will happen? So we need to ensure that no one is left behind. We've been talking about inequalities. So we need to invest more on strengthening our remote learning so that everybody will access the learning material. And this cannot be done overnight and cannot be done by one person or one department. So I call upon partnerships so that at least we make sure if we have any future shock, we are able to at least make sure that children are learning wherever they are by strengthening our learning, e-learning platform, remote learning. But before doing that, connectivity, electricity, water due to wash and hygiene facilities, internet, but also looking at the poorer students, devices, and other learning materials. So I think this will be a collective effort, and we have many partners that help us. Of course, I think we'll do that. In the long term, we can have this established system that will leave no one behind. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rose. Thanks to all of you. I guess my one takeaway is that there are a lot of issues in this area that is going to be going through a major transformation, whether we like it or not. I mean, that transformation is happening. The question is, are we going to help shape it and manage it, help the countries shape it and manage it? Because in the end, it is a nationally led thing, financed almost exclusively from national resources. And I think what we can try to do is bring best practice and experiences from around the world at a time of experimentation during a context of major change and transformation, and keep your eye on the long-term prize, and be willing to make the difficult political and policy and financing choices that will deliver that agenda. So I would say that the follow-up from this is that in a few months' time, if you're all up for it, we should come back and have a conversation on how we are actually making progress and whether the schools are opening or not. So thank you all again. And thanks to all of you who listened in. Please join me in thanking the participants, and we thank you for listening and participating.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thank you.